is that there's a structure at the end of our DNA, our chromosomes. Chromosomes is the strands where our DNA is located in our cells, in the nucleus of our cells. And these strands of chromosomes have at the end a structure called a telomere. A telomere is like the glue at the end of my shoelace to keep the strands from fraying, to keep it together. When we're born, our telomeres are a certain length. And as we get older, gradually, they shorten as we age. And until at the end of our life, they become unraveled, at which point so do we. Now, they looked at but it's a mark of aging, in other words. Now, they looked at the telomeres of mothers looking after chronically ill children. And they found that these women in their 30s and their 40s, their telomeres were 10 years shorter than their chronological age would have predicted. In other words, the chronic stress of caregiving aged them by 10 years. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that we shouldn't care for children or for other people that require our support. But it does mean that how we give care and what kind of support we get makes a huge difference to our health. And that's what my topic is about this morning. So the first clipping here is by a woman who writes the article herself. These are all from the Globe and Mail. And she's diagnosed with breast cancer. Her name is Donna. So she's diagnosed with breast cancer. And her doctor's name is Harold. Her husband's name is Hai. And Donna is the second wife. The first wife died of breast cancer. Now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with it. And so Donna writes, Harold tells me that the lump is small and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hai's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die, he reassures me. But I'm worried about Hai, I say. I won't have the strength to support him. And what do you notice? Her first and automatic thought is, how can I support my husband emotionally as I'm dealing with a potentially fatal illness? So this compulsive and automatic concern for the needs of others while ignoring your own is a major risk factor for chronic illness. The other clippings I will read you are obituaries, all from the Globe and Mail. Obituaries are fascinating because they tell us not only about the person who died, but also about what we as a society value in other people. And often what we value in other people is exactly what kills them in the first place. You heard the expression, the good die young? They do. And there's reasons for it. A lot of you are heaving a sigh of relief. Okay, I don't have to worry about myself then, you're saying so. But listen to these obituaries. This one is a doctor who died age 55. And I'm talking here about people who died before their time. This guy dies at age 55 in Toronto of cancer. The obituary says, and this is written as if it was a good thing, never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Toronto's Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties toward his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. Now, think about that one. If you're diagnosed with cancer, or if a friend of yours was diagnosed with cancer, would you say to him and her, hey buddy, here's what you do. Go back to work tomorrow. And all the time that you're getting chemotherapy and radiation and whatever else you're going through, just work every day until you die. So this compulsive and rigid identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the needs of the self is a major risk factor for illness. The next obituary is written by a husband about his wife, Naomi, who died at age 55 also of cancer. And he writes, in her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The worst she could say was phooey or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. Now, the suppression of, in other words, she never got angry with anybody. the suppression, the repression of healthy anger is a major risk factor for illness. It actually suppresses the immune system for reasons that I will tell you later. So there's basically 3 ways of dealing with anger. One is to repress it, like this woman did. So these are the people that are always nice. You know, they're always nice. I worry about really nice people. The other way is to give in to it and to act it out, to go into rages. That's also unhealthy. The first, the repression of anger, leads to autoimmune disease and cancer. When you're raging all the time, that increases your risk of heart disease and strokes. So in the aftermath, the studies have shown that in the aftermath of a rage episode, your risk of a heart attack doubles for the next 2 hours. Then there's the healthy expression of anger, or the healthy processing of anger, which most of us don't know how to do. We either do the one or we do the other. I'll talk to you about healthy anger later. But how do we deal with anger has a crucial effect on our health. And this guy writes, you know, she had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. And this is supposed to be a good thing. Now, my wife's name is Ray, and she's an artist, and it's one of her paintings that provided the detail here on the cover and the color scheme for the cover for this book. And sometimes I say to Ray, you know, we've been married 42 years. I go, well, why can't you blend in with the environment in an unassuming manner? But Ray has done her psychological work, and she's read my book, and she's also seen the studies. You know, there was a study just 4 or 5 years ago presented at a major medical conference. They looked at 1,700 women over a 10-year period. And over a 10-year period, out of these women, those who were unhappily married and suppressed their feelings were 4 times as likely to die as those who were also unhappily married but expressed their feelings. So the issue wasn't happy marriage or unhappy marriage. The issue was, did the woman express herself or did she not? So when I come to this point at my talk, this permits me to reassure the men in the audience that the next time you think your wife is a bitch, you should be glad about it. He writes something that's clearly, when we look at it, is self-destructive, but the person didn't realize it, and neither does the individual who writes the obituary. Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until her death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day, as his wife Rosalind and their 4 kids waited for him at home. Sidney would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy. Never wanting to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney kept eating 2 dinners a day for years until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. Okay? So that this poor man suffered under the belief that, number one, he was responsible how everybody else felt, and number 2, he must never disappoint anybody. So he actually couldn't say to his mother, you know, Mom, I got amazing news. I got 4 kids. And I'm going to have dinner with them most of the time. Nor could he say to his wife, you know, Rosalind, I'm very close with my mom. She needs my support. So once or twice a week, I'm going to have dinner with her. He just tried to please everybody all the time. And this need to please everybody all the time, it'll kill you. And for reasons I will tell you. And these reasons are not psychological. They're physiological. They have to do with the body, the immune system, and everything else. You can't separate the mind from the body. And the problem with my profession, the medical profession, is that we make 2 separations that are actually, in life, impossible to make. One is that we separate the mind from the body. We think that people's emotional lives are somehow separate from their physiology. Completely false assumption, unscientific, refuted by all the research, and yet if you go to a doctor, I mean, I know some of you here have had autoimmune illnesses, for example. So ask yourself, when you've been to the physician with your rheumatoid arthritis, your joint being inflamed, or some other rheumatic condition, did anybody ever ask you about your childhood? Anybody ever ask you about your stresses in your life? Anybody ever ask you about your marriage? About how you relate to your work? About how you look after yourself or how you don't? Likely not. Likely what they did is they said, you got this illness, we don't know why you got it, and here are the pills. So they'll give you a medication to suppress the inflammation, or they'll give you a medication because autoimmune disease, the immune system attacks the body itself, so we give you a medication to suppress the immune system itself, or we'll give you cortisol or some kind of other steroid. Well, that's all we do. We don't talk about the life factors that may have contributed to the onset of the illness. And you're going to wonder, why didn't anybody say this to me before? Because in the West, when I say the West, I mean the dominant Western culture, unlike Aboriginal cultures, unlike the traditional medicines of China or India or native traditions around the world, we separate the mind from the body. So we treat only the body, unless you have mental illness, in which case we still separate the mind from the body. And the other thing we separate is the individual from the environment. As I said to you last night, those of you that were there, you can't separate people from their environment. People are shaped by the environment. And in lifelong, in interaction with the environment is how human beings live. Now let me give you 3 examples of that. Why you can't separate people from the environment. It's been shown now, for example, that children whose parents are stressed are much more likely to have asthma. Now, not controversial. Several studies have shown that. So in polluted areas where there is more asthma, it's the kids of parents who are stressed who are most likely to have the asthma. Now, most doctors have never heard about that. And if they did, they can't explain it. And yet it's so obvious, you see. Those of you that have asthma, anybody had asthma here before in your life? Okay. You were given 2 kinds of inhalers if you had asthma. One inhaler is probably called Ventolin, and its job is to open up the airways, because what happens in asthma is you get a spasm of the muscles that surround the airways, so you get this narrowing of the tube through which air has to pass into the lungs, so you're wheezing and whistling and laboring your breathing. And the other inhaler you got would have been a steroid to suppress the inflammation, the swelling, and the inflammatory debris that clutters up the airway. So you get 2 inhalers. One is called a bronchodilator to dilate, open up the airway. The other is to suppress the inflammation. Now, what are these inhalers based on? The inhaler that opens up the airway is a copy of adrenaline. And the inhaler that opens up, that suppresses the inflammation is a copy of cortisol. Serve us, what are adrenaline and cortisol? They're stress hormones. Exactly. In other words, we're giving asthmatics stress hormones, the same stress hormones that are made by their own adrenal glands when they're stressed. All that's happened is that their own stress response mechanisms have been exhausted, and now we have to give them stress hormones from the outside. Now guess what? If you have rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, what will they give you? Cortisol, the stress hormone. Shouldn't we be asking ourselves that if we're treating people with stress hormones, whether or not there might be a connection between stress and their disease? Now, of course, why the children of parents who are stressed? Because the parents' stresses actually program the physiology of the child. Because you can't separate the individual from the environment. And this is true all our lives. A study of women in Australia, 500 women, 550 women, who had lumps in their breasts that were of sufficient concern as to require a biopsy. Now, they had these biopsies, but before the results came back, they also had a psychological interview or questionnaire. It turns out after the results came back that if a woman had had a significant stressful incident in her life just prior to the onset of that lump, that by itself had 0 effect on whether or not that lump was cancerous. Similarly, If a woman was emotionally isolated, that also had zero effect. But if a woman was emotionally isolated and had a major stressor, the risk of that lump being cancerous was 9 times as great as the average. Now, the medical doctors running the study couldn't understand this one either, because they said, how does 0 and 0 add up to 9? You see? Because we don't understand the connection between individuals and the environment. Now, here's the deal. If I were to act inappropriately towards you right now, if I were to stress you right now, physically or emotionally, you'd have 3 healthy options. But, well, no, let's see, I won't go into that right now. If I were to stress you right now, what would happen is that stress wouldn't just be in your head, it would be in your whole body. You know, your heart rate would go up, your nervous system would be firing off all kinds of impulses, your adrenal glands would be pouring adrenaline and cortisol so that you could escape or fight back. These are the flight or fight hormones. And so your body would be in a different state physiologically in a split second in order to help you fight to escape. That's good. So in the short term, the stress hormones help you fight or to escape. But what do they do in the long term? In the long term, the stress hormones deplete your body, suppress your immune system, give you heart disease, high blood pressure, give you ulcers, thin your bones. Okay? Now, what would happen if you were stressed, something happened that was stressful to you, and you're sitting there all upset about it, and your body is in a state of imbalance and upset, but somebody that you trust came along and said, hey friend, I see that you're not feeling well, I see that you're upset, puts a hand on your shoulder and says, hey, do you want to talk about it? Now what would happen to your body right away? Yes, it would relax. You'd take a deep breath. Your brain would get oxygen. You'd start thinking more clearly. Your heart rate would slow down. Your blood pressure diminish. The stress hormones abate in your system. And you go back into a healthy balance. All because somebody said, hey buddy, do you want to talk about it? Those women that had been stressed but were emotionally alone, the stress hormone acted on their system for months. That's why they were more likely to get cancer. It's really straightforward. In other words, again, the physiology of one individual can't be separated from the psychological and social environment. And finally, at the end of life, a study in a major medical journal a few years ago showed that amongst elderly couples, when one of them is hospitalized, what do you suppose happens to the other one? They get sick. In other words, the risk of illness goes up in the other one when the one is hospitalized. Why? Because our immune systems are not isolated from our psychological, emotional, social relationships. We can't separate the mind from the body, and you can't separate the individual from the environment.